preacher and grandson of preachers, both preachers on both sides of the family. He was ordained in 1944, in the American Baptist Church tradition. His work, manuscripts are archived at Virginia Union. He spent his married life with Mother Ella P. Mitchell, who was deeply important to me, who passed away in 2008. And they had been married at that point over 60 years.
64 years.
64 years.
3 months and 8 days.
Oh.
64 years, 3 months, and 8 days. And probably one of the most significant books to me that came out of that is Together for Good. And if you haven't read Together for Good, really, you should. In 1966, he was the first named Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Black Church Studies at Colgate Rochester Divinity School. King was still alive, and that was the first chair named after him anywhere in the country, and you occupied it in Black Church Studies. I just want y'all to really know who's in the room, because I think sometimes people think, why are we talking to this person? He's the founding director, along with Mother Mitchell, of the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies in LA, and was the first Black Church Studies program in the country. They're all over now. Y'all started that. He was professor of history and homiletics at the Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union, and also was acting dean. He was the visiting professor of homiletics at the ITC here in Atlanta. He taught at any number of places, adjunct, Claremont, where you graduated from, and other places. I mean, to say just where he's taught and the impact he's had on the people who currently teach preaching, and the impact he's had on some of your favorite preachers is phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. He's a native of Ohio. He already told you was married 64 years, 3 months, and 8 days. The foundational book he wrote that shifted, I think, a lot of the way people think about Black preaching was Celebration in Black Preaching. We'll talk about this, but I think that Papa Mitchell wrote about Black preaching from an academic setting, gave credence to this style of preaching that got dismissed by certain other folk. I'll just put it that way. You have a master's in linguistics, which the work you did was around Black preaching and the way people hear.
The master's thesis.
Mm-hmm. And the language and the way people hear. The phrase that I think I want us to start with is that Black preaching spoke the language of the soul of Black folk. You said, speaking the language of souls. That's something you said to Lydia Tapper when you interviewed with her. So help me welcome Dr. Mitchell. I should say that I'm Dr. Valerie Bridgeman, the founding president of WomanPreach, Inc., and also a homiletician and a biblical scholar. So, since this is going to be archived somewhere, we should get all of that on the table. Thank you for coming. I really mean that I'm having a conversation with one of my favorite people. So I wanted to start with the fact that your work happened, some of your sort of big work happened when the country was going through massive changes, civil rights movement, just a lot of upheaval. And I wonder, Dr. Mitchell, what Black preaching was doing, how you were thinking about it as both a preacher and a professor while all that was going on.
Well, the most interesting thing I think I can say about it all is that black preaching, when I started writing about it professionally, was a discipline of an ignorant people in the minds of most people, including themselves. And there was a sense in which a lot of black preachers who were fluent in black culture had a bad conscience about it. That is to say, I am preaching emotionally, etc., because that's what sells, but if I was like the white folks, I wouldn't do it and I would be right. Of course, it turns out they were wrong. But it is a fact that there were schools where a Caucasian professor would actually talk about a phenomenon such as shouting as a problem. They thought of shouting as virtually psychotic. What they didn't know, and what I suppose I'm the most guilty of all the people to break it open and start the other way, was that a lot of black folk would be crazy now if they weren't shouting it out, and shouting had not now become understood as a spiritually and psychiatrically healing process.
Right.
So the impact of my beginnings as a scholar occurred not because I hoped to be a scholar, I just stumbled into it. The Lord sort of led me into it, to say the truth about it. But I've had, I guess, hundreds of people say to me that whereas they used to preach with passion and bad conscience, that it is now understood that this is the way it's supposed to be.
So hooping, which is sort of the celebration that you talk about, is a part of that?
It's a part of the culture for some people.
Right.
When I was dean at Virginia Union, I had a lady to come to me and ask for a candidate, me to nominate a candidate, and I heard later, yes, he is. He's one of your best scholars. Oh, yes, he's a straight-A student. I wish he would quit chasing that bear up the tree. And what she meant was that he always wound up hooping, and hooping was not a part of her cultural expectation. And too many people have assumed that hooping was a manipulative pattern used to move people around, people for whom it had a nostalgic appeal. Now, what they did not know, and what they should have known to their good, was that the African speech systems out of which the first slaves came was a musical language, a tonal language, so that they had, for instance, a 3-tone system. If you don't know what I mean, maybe you'll know better than I say. If you have a 2-tone or bitonal system, you have a thing like the dots and dashes, etc., in the Morse code. This is 3, so it means that the high, medium, and low is what they
So the speaking drum is sort of a precursor to the preaching, that thing I do when I go right there.
The hooping, well, hooping had its roots in a tonal language, and it wasn't just drums, it was their own speeches had tonal characteristics, which were a part of the meaning system. It wasn't just something to excite people or entertain people. It's a part of the language.
Right.
And so the typical earlier, and even there are many people now that still have it, lover of hooping is a person who actually has nostalgic recollections of something in a, how should I call it, an unconscious memory of the good old days, so to speak, before we were submitted to the slavery system and all the stuff that's going with it. I like to hear a good hoop by a sincere preacher, but I have to admit that it was such an effective communicator with some people that it was misused and abused. People manipulated folk. People preached with a hoop and let the hoop substitute for substance.
Right.
And that has given hooping a bad name. But if you ever hear a really good hooper preacher with a good message and a sincere faith, you'll know that the only reason I don't hoop is because I didn't grow up in it.
Right.
If I could, I surely would.
I want to go, first of all, thank you for that, because that lesson alone was worth the admission, right? That way in which people talk about sort of cultural differences as if something is wrong with them and not just different, that I want to tell you that was worth the price of admission, right there.
Now, well, let me say this further, that I grew up in a high church Baptist, Second Baptist Columbus, Ohio. We always had college graduated preachers, and we didn't sing any gospel songs.
You sang all hymns?
Well, I know all of the book. But
by number?
But when I tried to hoop, for most situations, I learned to be careful and omit it because the people just laughed at me. They could tell it wasn't in the cultural expectations in which I was born.
I hear you.
And in my church, I could sing Handel's Messiah.
Right.
I grew up singing it. And my daughter over there still sings it. But I have learned to really enjoy a good hoop and all of the best of the culture because God has used it mightily.
But what you just pointed to is another reality, is that there isn't one black culture, that there are many ways in which the preaching happens in black cultures. I'm a daughter of a preacher. I have aunts and